History tells us a story that is almost too impossible to believe. That 500 Spanish adventurers arrived on the shores of a foreign land and, by the sheer power of steel and horses, toppled an empire of millions. It's a legendary tale, it's cinematic, and it is almost entirely a lie. The fall of the Aztecs wasn't just a conquest from the outside, it was a massive indigenous revolution, a biological apocalypse, and the collapse of a superpower that had become its own worst enemy. Today, we strip away 5 centuries of propaganda to find the reality hidden behind the Obsidian masks. This is the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire. And before we begin our journey, I'd love to know where you are joining us from today and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to read through the comments and see how far these stories travel across the world. So let me know below. Set the eagle and cactus story aside for a minute, because the first thing to understand is that those we call Aztecs today called themselves the Mexica, and when they entered the Valley of Mexico, they weren't greeted as founders. They were treated like a problem that had wandered in from the north. This was a crowded landscape of old city-states with pedigrees, temples, and long memories, and the Mexica had none of that polish, which mattered more than people like to admit, because legitimacy in the valley wasn't a vibe, it was power. For a while, they lived the way unwelcome newcomers often do, pushed to the edges, used, mocked, and tolerated only as long as they stayed useful. There's a detail that catches in the throat because it's so blunt. At one point, they were driven onto miserable land at Tizapan, a place said to be crawling with rattlesnakes, and the neighbors basically assumed the valley would solve its own Mexica problem for them. Instead, the Mexica killed the snakes and ate them. It's not a metaphor, it's the kind of story that survives because everyone remembered the feeling of it. The moment you realize the people you tried to starve out aren't just surviving, they're turning the trap into dinner. That's the tone they set early, and they backed it up in the only currency the valley always respected: organized violence. They became mercenaries, the hard fighters you hired when you wanted results and you didn't want to be blamed for how those results were achieved. And they weren't just taking random work, they were pulled into the orbit of Azcapotzalco, the dominant power in the region at the time, the kind of city-state that collected others like trophies and expected obedience like gravity. Serving Azcapotzalco meant the Mexica learned the valley's politics up close, not from speeches, but from marching orders, tribute demands, hostage exchanges, and the quiet way fear moves through alliances. It also meant everybody started associating them with the muscle behind the throne, the rough outsiders who would do what the civilized cities preferred not to say out loud. But usefulness is a dangerous role because sooner or later it tempts you into believing you're more than a tool, and the Mexica, step by step, started acting like it. The clearest early line crossing comes out of Culhuacan, a city with real prestige, where the Mexica tried to borrow legitimacy the fastest way anyone could, by tying themselves to noble blood. They asked the ruler for his daughter, presented it as a marriage alliance, a step into the established world, and he agreed, probably thinking he was taming them, wrapping them in the rules of decent society. Then the Mexica sacrificed her, and they invited her father to the ceremony as if it were a celebration. That wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a message delivered in the harshest language the valley had, and once it was spoken, everyone around them had to face a new reality. These outsiders weren't just hired hands or hungry refugees anymore. They were a group willing to burn every bridge on purpose if it meant stepping out of the shadows and forcing the valley to say their name. So when people say Aztec Empire, It's easy to picture a clean map with borders, governors, and a single capital controlling everything like a modern state, but the real system was both simpler and more unsettling. It worked less like conquering and holding land, and more like building a network where everyone around you pays, publicly and regularly, because everyone has seen what happens when you don't. The turning point comes in the early 1400s, after the Mexica and their partners break the power of Azcapotzalco and then do something very pragmatic with the victory. They formalize a deal. Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan form what we call the Triple Alliance, and on paper it can look like a partnership, 3 cities agreeing to cooperate. In practice, it becomes a machine for extraction, and the alliance is the machine's engine. The genius of it is that it doesn't require the Mexica to occupy every place they dominate. They don't need to replace local rulers everywhere or turn the valley into one uniform blob. Most towns keep their own leaders, their own gods, their own daily life, as long as the tribute flows and the political posture stays obedient. The tribute is the point. It's measured, scheduled, recorded, and demanded in a way that turns distance into something manageable. You can be 2 weeks away and still feel the pressure because the demand arrives with a calendar and the memory of punishment. And the tribute itself isn't just generic taxes, it's specific items in specific quantities: cotton cloth, cacao, maize, beans, obsidian blades, feathers, salt, rubber, jaguar skins, copper bells, sometimes warriors, sometimes labor. The list tells you what the region can produce, and it tells you what the center wants to display. These goods don't just feed people, they stage power. When the flow is steady, the capital looks like it's at the center of the world, and that perception is part of the control. The alliance also spreads risk and spreads profit. Early on, there's a known split in who gets what share, with Tenochtitlan and Texcoco taking the biggest cuts and Tlacopan taking less. And that detail matters because it shows this is not a mystical union, it's an agreement about revenue. But arrangements like that rarely stay frozen. And over time, Tenochtitlan begins to act less like a partner and more like the one setting the terms, quietly pulling weight from Texcoco and turning an alliance of equals into something closer to a one-city dictatorship with 2 names still on the letterhead. To keep this kind of system running, you need more than soldiers, you need information. And the Mexica had a built-in way to get it. The Pochteca, long-distance merchants, weren't just moving luxury goods, they were the eyes and ears of the whole operation. They walked into distant markets, listened to gossip, noticed what people were wearing, what was for sale, how full the storehouses looked, how confident the local rulers seemed, and how many warriors might actually show up if a fight broke out. Then they went home, and the center suddenly knew where the next pressure point was. The enforcement side is where the modern comparison starts to make sense as a metaphor. If a city refuses to pay or tries to switch loyalties, the response is not a polite negotiation between equal states. The evidence suggests it's meant to be a lesson. Military campaigns are timed, targeted, and theatrical enough that everyone nearby understands the warning. Some communities are punished, some are replaced with more compliant leadership, some are forced back into line with hostages and new tribute terms. The point is not to administer every street corner, it's to keep the payment system credible. What makes it feel like a protection racket, in the loose, explanatory sense, is that the alliance offers a kind of stability at a price. Pay, and your local rulers usually stay in place. Pay, and trade routes stay safer. Pay, and you're on the right side of the regional order. Refuse, and the violence is not random, it's calibrated to be remembered. It's also worth noting that this system creates a strange kind of fragility. Because it runs on compliance, it produces a map full of places that are not Aztec in their identity, only connected by obligation and fear and calculation. Some towns benefit, some resent it, some play along while looking for an opening. And the center has to keep proving it can reach out and hurt you if you stop paying. Which means the machine is always hungry, always moving, always needing victories to keep the story alive. Under that pressure, Tenochtitlan rises fast, grows rich, and begins to look inevitable. But underneath, even the core partnership is bending, and beyond it, the alliance is stitching together a world that many people endure rather than embrace. And that difference between obedience and loyalty will matter later in ways the rulers at the center can't fully control. It's tempting to treat the Mexica as if they were built from only two materials, muscle and fear, but that misses the other half of the story, the part that actually made their power durable. Behind the armies and tribute lists was a class of people whose job was to think, to teach, to remember, and to turn chaos into a system. Because an expanding hegemony doesn't run on bravery alone, it runs on trained minds. In Tenochtitlan, education wasn't some private luxury, it was a public project, and it started with a split that mattered. Most boys went to the Tenochtitlan, a school that drilled discipline, labor, and fighting. But the elite track was the Kalmakak, and it produced the people who would hold the state together with words and numbers and ritual knowledge. Priests, scribes, judges, diplomats, and advisors came out of that world. They learned calendars, genealogies, legal customs, and the complicated etiquette of status, the kind of knowledge that decides who is owed respect and who can be crushed without consequences. And they learned a very particular idea about truth. The phrase "Inzochitl inquicatl," flower and song, wasn't just a pretty slogan, it was a claim that the deepest truths on earth can only be approached through crafted speech, through poetry, through the kind of language that admits life is slippery. In that world, a noble warrior was supposed to be dangerous in battle and disciplined in words, and the ability to shape a metaphor could sit right beside the ability to swing a macuajitl without flinching. This is also why their writing looked so different from European habits. Their books, the codices, weren't alphabets marching in neat lines. They were visual systems, part pictogram, part symbol, part rebus. Reading one wasn't like sounding out letters, it was closer to decoding a dense diagram where images carried names, dates, places, numbers, and political claims all at once. A skilled scribe wasn't simply writing, they were building a visual world that trained the reader to think in layered meanings, to hold several kinds of information in the mind at the same time. That mental flexibility mattered because statecraft for the Mexica was a constant act of translation, turning local realities into something the capital could measure, schedule, and control. The tribute records were not clerical trivia, they were a living map of obligations and resources. The priests reading omens weren't only predicting the future, they were helping the state explain disaster, choose timing, and justify decisions in public. The calendars stitched agriculture, taxation, warfare, and ceremony into a shared rhythm, so the center could coordinate far-flung demands without being everywhere at once. And their philosophers and poets kept returning to an uncomfortable theme, that life is brief, unstable, and easy to lose, that the world doesn't offer firm ground for long. You hear it in the way their songs worry at the same question, are we truly living on Earth or just passing through? And the point isn't gloom, It's a worldview shaped by war, drought, famine, and sudden reversals of fortune. Many researchers think this obsession with impermanence wasn't separate from governance. It was part of how leaders were trained to act under uncertainty, to seek fame that outlives the body, and to build institutions that can hold the center when everything feels fragile. One figure who embodies that training is Moctezuma II, a product of the Calmecac world, often described as intensely pious and deeply reflective, more priestly and cerebral than the heroic warrior stereotype. His mind was built to read signs, weigh meanings, and question appearances, and later, when a new and baffling threat enters the valley, that habit of doubt and interpretation will stop being a private virtue and start becoming something far more dangerous. Look closely at how the violence was staged, and you realize it wasn't only about winning battles, it was about broadcasting power, teaching whole regions what resistance would cost, and doing it in a way that traveled farther than any messenger. Human sacrifice sits at the center of this, and it's easy to either sanitize it or turn it into a horror story, but neither approach explains why it mattered politically. The evidence suggests it functioned as a public technology of intimidation, a way to turn war into a spectacle that didn't just remove enemies, it reshaped the emotions of everyone watching from the sidelines. It was designed to be seen. Sacrifices were carried up the steps of the great temple and performed at the top, high above the city, so the act didn't disappear into a back room, it sat in the skyline. From far away, you could hear the rhythm, drums stretched with skin, and you could see the temple faces stained and repainted in reds that read like a warning even at a distance. This was part of the city's interface, a message you couldn't mute because it was built into the horizon. Captives weren't always treated as anonymous bodies. In many cases, they became living proof that the center could reach out, seize you, and turn your defeat into a ceremony that made the capital look untouchable. The killing itself was only one part. There was the procession, the timing, the choreography, the crowd, the priests, the music, the precise order of actions, all designed to make the lesson hard to forget. And it wasn't only aimed outward, it disciplined the Mexica themselves, binding warriors to the state through a clear reward structure, because taking captives was status, and status was access to privilege. In that sense, the ritual economy and the military economy interlocked. You don't just fight to survive, you fight to climb, to earn recognition, to prove you belong among the elite. And peace would flatten the ladder a lot of people were trying to climb. This is where the so-called flower wars often enter the conversation, and it's a tricky topic because popular retellings sometimes make them sound like ceremonial sports. Many researchers describe them as highly formalized conflicts, with rules and expectations that could emphasize capturing over killing. But for the people caught in them, they weren't gentle or symbolic. Being taken alive could be just as final as being struck down on the field. And the flower language wasn't about softness, it was about a particular ideal of death, the idea that dying in battle could be spoken of as a flowery death. There are different interpretations of the larger purpose, but one plausible reading is that these conflicts helped maintain pressure on key rivals, draining them, keeping them off balance, and feeding the state's need for captives and prestige at the same time. Underneath all of this sits a belief that makes the system feel even more relentless, because to the Mexica, this wasn't just politics, it was maintenance work for the universe. They believed the sun was a debt that had to be paid every single morning, and blood was part of how you kept the world from slipping into darkness. That conviction didn't soften the terror, it deepened it, because it meant the people running the machine could see themselves as both rulers and caretakers, even while their neighbors saw them as predators. Terror in that environment becomes logistical. It has routes, schedules, and incentives. It relies on intelligence about who is wavering and who is strong. It relies on local rivalries that can be exploited, on tribute assessments that can be tightened, on punishments that can be calibrated. And it relies on the fact that the capital doesn't need to destroy everyone all the time. It needs selective, memorable demonstrations that keep most communities choosing compliance on their own. Over time, this kind of pressure does something corrosive. It produces outward obedience, but it also produces quiet coalitions of resentment, groups that may not love each other, but share a common desire to see the center humbled. The state becomes incredibly good at converting fear into order, but when fear is a foundation, not a byproduct, it carries a risk that never goes away. Because the moment people believe the center can be beaten, all that stored resentment doesn't vanish, it rushes forward. And the spectacle that once terrified everyone can start to read like a sign of weakness instead of strength. By the time Moctezuma II is in power, the state looks triumphant from the outside. Rich markets, full storehouses, armies that can still march, tribute arriving like clockwork, and a capital that feels less like a city and more like a statement. But peak power has a weird effect. It can hide the way a society is tightening up inside, the way the spaces for breathing and improvising start to close. Moctezuma II inherits a system that already runs on hierarchy, and under him that hierarchy hardens. One concrete sign, mentioned in several accounts, is how aggressively he reshaped the inner circle when he took the throne, pushing aside many of his predecessors' advisors and replacing them with high-status, pure nobles, the kind of move that tells ambitious outsiders, the door is closing, stop knocking. Commoners still have paths upward in theory, especially through military achievement, but the climb becomes steeper and more controlled, like someone quietly raised the ladder and then blamed you for not reaching it. You can see it in law and custom, in the way clothing rules, privileges, and public behavior mark status with obsessive precision, as if society is trying to make inequality feel natural by making it visible everywhere. And you can feel it in the tribute burden. A machine that feeds on scheduled extraction tends to demand more as it expands, and the farther you are from the capital, the easier it is to become just a line in a record, a place that exists to deliver cotton, maize, cacao, labor, bodies. For local communities, the pressure isn't abstract. It lands on households, it lands on harvests, it lands on the constant need to meet quotas while still feeding your own people. When droughts or bad years hit, the system doesn't magically become merciful, it becomes more desperate because the center still expects its flow. That creates a dangerous mood in the provinces, not open rebellion everywhere, but a simmering sense that the order is feeding on you and calling it peace. Inside the capital, there's another tension building, because a rich imperial center also becomes a magnet. Elites compete for influence, offices, and prestige, and political life starts to feel like a court, full of careful words, factional moves, and status games. Moctezuma himself is often described as formal, austere, and intensely concerned with ritual correctness, and the protocol around him wasn't just etiquette, it was political engineering. Some sources describe rules where even top nobles avoided meeting his gaze, approached barefoot, and treated access to his presence like entering a sacred space, which increases awe, but also makes the ruler feel less like a human leader and more like a distant force. That distance can be useful, but it also deepens resentment, because the gap between the ruler and the ruled starts to feel like a wall. At the same time, the empire's success creates a basic strategic problem. When your power rests on tribute and fear, you're constantly creating people who have reasons to want you gone. You can buy time with punishment. You can buy compliance with selective rewards, but you don't buy love and you don't erase memory. By 1519, the network is huge, and that means the list of grudges is huge too. Many subject towns have their own rivalries, their own humiliations, their own stories about hostage-taking, heavy demands, or brutal examples made of neighbors. Even some allies begin to wonder whether the center is becoming too greedy, too entitled, too sure it will never be challenged. And then there's the psychological ceiling, the one inside the ruling class itself. When a system is built on ritual certainty, on the idea that the universe has rules you can maintain through correct behavior, it can make leaders less flexible when something truly unfamiliar appears. The empire under Moctezuma II is not collapsing yet, but it's stiffening. It's becoming brilliant at repeating what worked yesterday and less capable of adapting to what tomorrow might bring. The surface is polished, almost flawless, and underneath it you can feel stress lines spreading, the kind that don't matter until the moment something sharp hits the glass. When the strangers first appear on the coast, the easiest way to tell this story is as an invasion, a straight line of steel and gunpowder moving inland, but that framing skips the part that actually decides the early outcome. The diplomacy. Before it turns into open war, it starts as a contest over information, over alliances, over interpretation, with both sides trying to read the other while hiding their own intentions. Moctezuma II is watching a new kind of actor enter his political world, and he does what a careful ruler trained in the Calmecac tradition might do. He tries to contain the problem without lighting the whole valley on fire. That means gifts, messages, controlled access, and constant observation. The Spanish are dangerous, but at first they're also small, vulnerable, and dependent on local food, guides, and political permission. So the question for the Mexica leadership isn't only can we crush them, it's what are they, and who are they connected to? Because in the valley, a minor force can become a major threat if it plugs into the right network of enemies. Cortés, meanwhile, has something that functions like a key, a person who can move between worlds. Malinche, often called Doña Marina, is more than a translator in the narrow sense. She helps turn sounds into meaning, yes, but she also understands how power and humiliation travel in this landscape, which words signal submission, which promises are traps, and where the seams of the system might split if you press them. Through her, truth and deception can flow both ways, and without that bridge, the Spanish would have been half blind, stuck guessing at a political map they couldn't read. Moctezuma's famous hospitality, then, can be read less as naivete and more as a gamble, a calculated attempt to neutralize an unknown group by pulling it into the imperial web, surrounding it with protocol, comfort, and surveillance, and learning everything possible before choosing a final move. There's a cold logic here. You bring the outsiders into the capital, you keep them close, you keep them watched, you limit their ability to roam and recruit, and you signal to everyone else that the center is in control. It's also a way to avoid panic, because if the capital declares an existential war too early, it might encourage subject towns to test their luck. So for a moment, the system does what it knows how to do. It tries to turn a threat into a managed relationship. The Spanish, for their part, are playing their own game, projecting weakness when it helps, projecting divine confidence when it helps, taking notes on what they see, and pushing hard on the psychology of the court. They notice the weight of ceremony, the obsession with signs, the political value of captives and tribute, and they understand that the quickest path forward is not a siege of a city they don't yet know how to feed themselves around, but a chain of alliances with the people who already hate that city. Even early on, while Cortés is smiling and accepting gifts, he is not alone in any meaningful sense. Behind him stand thousands of indigenous allies, especially Tlaxcalans, people with their own brutal history with Mexica pressure, people who can supply food, fighters, intelligence, and local legitimacy, and who are waiting for the moment when talk turns into a chance to strike. That's the deeper fear from the Mexica side. It isn't just a few hundred foreigners, it's the possibility that these foreigners become a detonator, a moving excuse for every resentful rival to coordinate at once. Even the early exchanges of gifts have a double edge, because gifts are never just gifts here. They are tests, measurements, messages. What does the other side value? What do they fear? What do they think you are? And the Spanish do something that the Mexica system is not built to expect from guests. They keep moving. They keep asking to see more, to meet more, to travel farther. They turn curiosity into a weapon. When they reach Tenochtitlan, the city itself becomes part of the contest. It is breathtaking, a place built on water with causeways like arteries, markets humming, temples rising, and that matters because it can intimidate as much as it can impress. Moctezuma offers lodging, ceremony, food, and a kind of controlled proximity that feels like a velvet cage. Some sources suggest the Mexica court was gathering intelligence constantly, watching how the Spaniards behaved, how they reacted to ritual, what they demanded, what they refused, who among them seemed to lead, and how quickly they could turn violence on and off. But intelligence gathering only works if you can act on it in time, and this is where the gamble begins to fail. The Spanish are not just guests, they are also taking the ruler himself as a lever. They move from being received to being impossible to remove without consequence, and then, in the most shocking pivot of the early encounter, they seize Moctezuma inside his own city, turning the sacred distance he built around himself into a trap. A ruler who cannot be looked in the eye, who is approached barefoot, suddenly becomes a hostage, and the entire political atmosphere changes. The old tools of intimidation and protocol don't work the same way when the center's living symbol is under guard. From that point on, diplomacy doesn't end. It becomes war by other means, and the city is no longer just managing outsiders, it's managing the terrifying possibility that the rules of the valley have been rewritten while everyone was still trying to interpret the signs. This is the frame that changes everything. This wasn't a simple story of a small band of Europeans toppling a giant by themselves. It was a regional explosion, a massive indigenous revolt that the Spanish were able to ride like a wave. The Mexica had built an order that extracted tribute, demanded obedience, and used fear as a kind of glue. And for many communities, that order was not a shared identity. It was a burden they carried because they had to. So when an outside force appeared that could be used as a lever against Tenochtitlan, a lot of people didn't see foreign invaders as the main event. They saw an opening. Tlaxcala is the clearest example, a powerful rival that had resisted Mexica domination for years, sometimes described as surrounded and pressured, sometimes locked into cycles of war and diplomacy where peace never really arrived. When Cortés reached them, the relationship didn't start as friendship. They fought him, tested him, tried to understand what he was. Then they made a choice that looks ruthless but also very logical from their perspective. They allied with him, not because they fell in love with Spanish promises, but because they recognized a rare chance to break the system that had been choking them. And once that alliance formed, it didn't stay small. Other groups joined for their own reasons. Old grudges, lost autonomy, tribute demands, hostage-taking, local rivalries, and the simple desire to settle scores that had been building for generations. The Spanish could offer a symbol and a spark, but the manpower, the food supply, the knowledge of terrain, and the political legitimacy in the region came overwhelmingly from indigenous allies. That's what turns this into something closer to a civil war. Not in the sense that everyone shared one national identity, but in the sense that the fighting was rooted in local politics, local memories, and local calculations about who should rule. If you want to understand why Tenochtitlan ends up isolated, you have to understand how the tribute network also functioned as a map of resentment. The same routes that carried cotton and cacao to the capital could also carry news of weakness and plans for revenge. The same intelligence channels that once helped the Mexica find pressure points could now be used against them. And when the moment comes, you can see the scale of the uprising in the way campaigns unfold, not as tiny foreign raids, but as huge movements of allied forces, city after city, community after community, choosing to throw in their lot against the center. It's also important to notice that this coalition wasn't a pure moral crusade. Alliances were transactional. Some groups fought to free themselves. Some fought to replace one master with another. Some fought to gain advantage over neighboring rivals. Many probably believed they could use the Spanish and then manage them later, the way you might use any dangerous tool in a desperate situation. And the Spanish encouraged that thinking, promising autonomy, promising lighter burdens, promising a new order that sounded to many ears like relief. This is why Moctezuma's fear makes sense. He wasn't staring at a few hundred Spaniards and imagining their swords winning an impossible fight. He was imagining the chain reaction, the possibility that his enemies would coordinate around this new presence, that the whole structure of obedience would flip into open hostility. Once the revolt is underway, the psychological world changes. Fear stops flowing in one direction. The center's punishments stop being inevitable. And when inevitability disappears, the empire's greatest weapon, its reputation, begins to lose its edge. From that point, every battle is not only a clash of bodies, it's a referendum on whether Tenochtitlan can still command the region, and as more communities choose the uprising, the answer becomes harder to contain. Because the old world isn't simply being conquered, it's being pulled apart from within by the people who had been forced to hold it up. The Spanish brought iron and horses, yes, but they also brought an invisible hitchhiker that would do more damage than any cannon. No army, no alliance, no brilliant plan really prepares you for the moment when the enemy is suddenly inside your own body, moving from house to house without needing roads, weapons, or negotiations. This is the part of the story that often gets described in cold numbers, but it was experienced as something intimate and humiliating. A sickness that arrives like smoke and then doesn't care who you are. Smallpox tears through the region and then through the city, and once it takes hold, it attacks the defenders in a way steel can't. The evidence suggests it hit at exactly the worst time, when the political situation was already unstable and the city was already under pressure. And it did what epidemics so often do in crowded places. It broke routines. People who would normally carry water, grind maize, repair walls, tend canals, and move food through the markets become sick or vanish behind doorways that turn quiet. Warriors who would normally stand in formation can't stand. Messengers stop traveling. Priests and leaders who would normally coordinate rituals and morale get pulled into emergency care and mourning. A city that is essentially an engineered ecosystem built on water and constant movement starts to seize up. And smallpox doesn't just remove labor, it shreds confidence. It makes the future feel unsafe in a way that no battle can, because you can't watch the front line if you don't know which breath might be the one that infects you. It also changes the enemy's face in the most literal way. The body breaks out, swells, blisters, and scars, and for a society that cared deeply about ritual cleanliness, presentation, and the dignity of a controlled public life, the sight of people rotting in pain, their features distorted beyond recognition, wasn't just death, it was an assault on identity, like the world was erasing faces along with lives. It hits leadership, too. In a crisis, chain of command matters, and disease is a chain cutter. When commanders die or are incapacitated, plans don't get carried out, discipline frays, and rumors fill the gaps. In some accounts, the epidemic kills Tlatoani, the ruler who follows Moctezuma during the early phase of the conflict, and even if details vary across sources, the broader point remains. The top of the system is not protected. The sickness doesn't respect status. That matters psychologically, because the whole Mexica world is built on the idea that ritual, hierarchy, and correct behavior maintain order. When death ignores those structures, it can feel like the universe itself is slipping its tracks. And now add the second siege on top of the first. While fever burns people from the inside, the physical blockade tightens, aqueducts are cut, and water becomes a daily panic, so for many inside the city, there's nothing to drink but brackish lake water that tastes like salt and desperation. A siege is about supplies, and an epidemic is a siege that also steals the people who would handle the supplies. Even if you have food, you need bodies to distribute it, cook it, guard it, and transport it along canals and causeways. When those bodies are sick, the city becomes fragile from the inside. Meanwhile, the attackers, especially the indigenous allies, can keep rotating fresh fighters and labor in and out of the campaigns, pulling from a wider regional pool, while Tenochtitlan is trapped with what it has, and what it has is shrinking. You can call this a biological siege because it behaves like one. It narrows the city's options, reduces its ability to respond, and turns every delay into a loss. It also changes the moral economy of the war. Some people interpret the disaster through religion, through omen and cosmic debt, asking what has been offended. Others interpret it through politics, asking who has failed and whether the rulers can still protect the people. Both interpretations weaken cohesion because they push blame inward at the worst moment. And in the middle of that, the fighting continues because war doesn't pause for grief. The result is a collapse in morale that doesn't come from cowardice, it comes from exhaustion, confusion, and the feeling that the ground rules have changed. A steel sword can kill a man. A disease can make a whole city doubt itself. And once that doubt spreads through households and leadership at the same time, the defenders aren't just resisting an army, they're trying to hold together a society that is coming apart in their hands. Now the war stops looking like a campaign and starts looking like an autopsy performed while the patient is still breathing. Tenochtitlan is no longer the confident center of a tribute world. It's an island of ruin, surrounded by enemies who know the streets, the canals, the rhythms, and who are willing to die to finish what they started. Cuauhtémoc takes leadership in a moment when leadership is almost a cruel joke, because the city he inherits is starving, sick, and cut into pieces by broken causeways and contested water. He is young, but not naive, and the sources that describe him tend to return to the same quality, a stubborn refusal to surrender, even when surrender starts looking like the only rational option. What follows is not the clean fall of a capital, it's urban warfare in a city built on water, a fight that turns bridges into choke points and canals into killing zones. The Spanish bring brigantines onto the lake, and this is where technical ingenuity meets pure desperation. Those ships don't just support attacks, they hunt canoes, cut supply lines, and turn the lake into a controlled space, a wall on the water that flips Tenochtitlan's greatest advantage into a cage. A city that lived through boats suddenly finds the water isn't a road anymore, it's a prison grate, and food that might have slipped in by canoe now gets intercepted, spilled, or captured. The defenders answer with everything they have left: ambushes, barricades, rooftop attacks, night raids, and desperate counterstrikes meant to buy hours, not victory. Every step forward is paid for, and every step back feels like losing a piece of the world. Inside the city, the ordinary machinery of life is collapsing. Markets shrink, food becomes a rumor, clean water becomes a memory. Bodies, human and animal, pile up in places that used to be ceremonial centers, and the smell becomes part of the battlefield, a constant reminder that the fight is happening inside a living space, not out on some distant plain. The psychological pressure is brutal, because Tenochtitlan has always been a place that performed order through ceremony, through rhythm, through controlled public life, and now everything is disorder. The temples are still there, but their power feels inverted because the gods are not keeping the city safe. The enemy is inside the walls, and the walls are the city itself. This is also where the coalition against the Mexica shows its true scale. The Spanish are visible. Their armor and horses make them look like the story's main characters, but the fighting force around them is largely indigenous, especially Tlaxcalans and other allies who do the exhausting work of assault, clearing, carrying, and holding ground in a city that keeps trying to swallow them. And it isn't only fighting. As the siege grinds on and the victory becomes inevitable, those same allies begin tearing the city down, stone by stone, timber by timber, stripping buildings, pulling apart walls, erasing temples and homes as an act of final liberation and final revenge, as if they're trying to make sure the symbol that dominated them can never stand upright again. The defenders, for their part, are not fighting for an abstract empire anymore. They're fighting for the last scraps of home, for the idea that their city cannot become someone else's trophy. Accounts describe scenes of civilians caught in the middle, people trying to flee across water that is controlled by enemies, people dying of hunger, people still attempting to maintain some kind of ritual normalcy in the middle of collapse, because when everything else is gone, routine can feel like the last form of resistance. Eventually, the city is reduced to fragments, and Cuauhtémoc is cornered. The story of his capture often centers on a canoe on the lake, a last attempt to escape or regroup, intercepted and brought in. And then comes one of those moments that survives because it compresses a whole tragedy into a few words. When he is brought before Cortez, several sources say Cuauhtémoc gestures to the dagger and tells him, "I have done everything I could to defend my city. Now take this and kill me." It's not a plea for mercy, it's a demand for an ending that matches the role he has been forced to play. The last ruler of a collapsing world asking for the cleanest ritual conclusion he can imagine. After he is taken, the final surrender follows, not because everyone suddenly agrees, but because the physical possibility of coordinated defense is gone. And what's left at the end is not a romantic tableau, it's the brutal end of a superpower. A capital that had once made the whole valley look up at its skyline, now stripped, burned, and emptied, with survivors walking through ruins that still carry the shape of their old world, even as that world is being dismantled piece by piece in front of them. It's easy to think of an empire as something that dies on a specific day. A capital falls, a ruler is captured, a new flag goes up, and that's the end. But what happened in central Mexico is messier and in some ways more interesting. The political superstructure is shattered, yes, yet so much of what made the Mexica world function doesn't vanish because it's embedded in habits, in crops, in roads, in paperwork, and in language itself. The conquerors destroy temples and rewrite the skyline, but they also inherit a place that already knows how to organize labor, move goods, record obligations, and feed a huge urban population. And it's hard to run a new regime without using at least some of the old tools. The tribute logic, the census-like attention to who owes what, the reliance on local elites as intermediaries, these don't disappear so much as they get repurposed, translated into a different legal and religious vocabulary, while still doing familiar work on the ground. Even the city doesn't entirely go away. The ruins of Tenochtitlan become the foundation for a new capital, and the lake, the causeways, the old channels of movement keep shaping daily life long after the last Tlatoani is gone. And then there's the softer legacy, the one that slips into the modern world without asking permission. Foods that were ordinary in the Mexica diet become global staples. Tomatoes, avocados, cacao turned into chocolate. These aren't just flavors, they're entire agricultural systems traveling outward, carrying the ecological knowledge of Mesoamerica into other continents. Words travel with them. You can hear the ghost of Nahuatl every time those foods are named, little fragments of an older world living inside everyday speech, even among people who have never heard the word Mexica. You can see it, too, in the way place names survive, in the way local communities keep practices that don't fit neatly into imported categories, in the way saints and festivals sometimes settle into older rhythms rather than replacing them. And there's a deeper point here, beyond vocabulary and cuisine. The Mexica built a state that was intensely administrative, obsessed with record-keeping, schedules, and public performance. They trained elites to speak in layered meanings, to think visually through codices, to treat politics as a system of obligations reinforced by spectacle. After the fall, that human infrastructure doesn't evaporate. Scribes become clerks, nobles become local brokers. Markets keep running because people still need to eat. Water still needs to be managed. Fields still need to be planted. The machine keeps turning, even with different hands on the levers, because daily life forces continuity, even when history claims a clean break. At the same time, the fall leaves a warning embedded in the story. A hegemony held together by fear and extraction can look solid right up until the moment everyone decides it isn't. A society that believes it is maintaining the universe can become trapped by the very rituals that once gave it confidence. And a capital that seems untouchable can become isolated when the people around it stop seeing obedience as inevitable. None of that erases the Mexica achievement, the engineering of a city on water, the intellectual culture that treated in Xochitl, in Quicat, flower and song, as a way to tell the truth in a world where truth is hard to hold, the ability to coordinate a vast network without modern technology. It just puts it in a human frame, brilliant, adaptive, often ruthless, and ultimately vulnerable. And maybe that's the final twist. For all the talk of terror, tribute, and spectacle, what lasts most stubbornly is not the machinery that frightened their neighbors. It's the idea that meaning can survive violence, that a people can be remembered not only for what they took, but for what they made in words, for the flowers and songs that kept insisting against all evidence that life is brief and still worth naming. Thank you so much for watching our video and supporting the channel. See you in the next episodes, and good night.